Now, I got to tell you, all week long here and even before, the debate over measles vaccinations has not only been unending, but I think it's even ramped up here. This coming after most recently that outbreak at Disneyland. It raised concerns about the number of parents in the U.S., and it's a growing number, who are refusing to vaccinate their kids. Now, these people, who are being referred to as anti-vaxxers, they believe that the measles vaccine is linked to autism. Now, this despite the fact that every medical professional that we can find here, let alone leaders in the medical community in terms of organizations, CDC, AMA, et cetera, nobody believes that there is any linkage between the two. Now, authorities do say here that the disease was declared eradicated. Think about that. We got rid of this disease back in 2000, but now, in 2015 here, we're on the heels of last year being the highest resurgence of cases. We had 644 reported over 27 states last year, and already more in the beginning of this calendar year. Today, I spoke with Arthur Kaplan. He is the founding director of medical ethics at NYU's Langone Medical Center, and we talked about anti-vaxxers, the autism argument, and also about the question of liability. Before I even get into where liability may start and stop, to me, explain to the layperson here, because there's so much rational sense that seems to be going out the window with this. Apply some of the logic. I know some people believe that there is a connection between inoculation and autism, even though medical science, I think, clearly has said there isn't. Do you believe a lot of this is complacency, or do you think it's something more that is distrust of government, wanting to believe in conspiracy theories? What do you think is at the root of the growing numbers of people who are choosing not to vaccinate their kids?
Well, there's no doubt that parents, or some parents, not most parents do vaccinate, but some parents are afraid. They still haven't accepted the idea that there's no connection, none, between autism and vaccination. And I say that because even here at NYU, we're starting to be able to diagnose autism earlier than the age at which you start your vaccination. So the link is broken. Everybody knows autism rates, sadly, tragically, have been growing. Vaccination rates have been declining. So just on those facts alone, aside from all the studies that have been done, the fear is unfounded. I think some people worry that vaccination is a little bit of a plot by the pharmaceutical industry to sell us drugs. And in that regard, my view is I wish it were so. I wish the pharmaceutical industry would be more committed to prevention. You know, they make much more money selling us cures for cervical cancer and other diseases than they do preventing them. I wish we could get them to devote most of their resources to prevention. That's what vaccines are. And I think some people worry about the unnaturalness of vaccines, and that's more recent. They start to say, oh, it's not organic, it's not natural. But you know, the things that you use to get a vaccine to work, the viruses that are dead or half dead to get an immune response, they're out in nature too. There's nothing particularly unnatural about using a virus that's circulating anyway and trying to use a piece of it or a toned down version of it to get a reaction from you. You'd be more at risk in terms of exposing your children to microbes to let the baby get licked by the dog than even giving them 7 or 8 vaccines.
Let me get to the bioethical question, because I think what has tweaked me, and I think so many people, is if I got a kid under the age of 1, or I have a loved one that's got immune deficiency issues, they didn't choose that. That's their age and that's their medical condition.
Right.
But some parent out there is deciding that they know better than science or medicine, than the AMA, the CDC, Surgeon General, you name any acronym you want to give, and they're not going to inoculate their kid. But they're still going to take their kid to Disneyland. They're still going to put their kid on a train. They're still going to put their kid in school, or whatever the case may be. I know it's state by state right now where there's certain exemptions, including philosophical ones, but is that just enough to say, I don't agree with science and I'm going to go do this? Or should there be some liability from an ethicist standpoint for those parents who make a conscious decision not to vaccinate their kids and exposing other people in the process to the consequences?
Well, you know, there are some pretty fierce defenders of parental right to choose out there. But even if you want to defend the right to choose to do something unneighborly, to do something, in my view, stupid and not vaccinate your kid, it doesn't mean you should be released from the consequences of that decision. You know, I can sit in my house and drink all day long and get inebriated, but if I drive my car and run you over, I'm responsible for that choice. I can own a gun and I can keep it in my house. If I leave it on the table and invite some kids over and something happens, I'm responsible. You choose not to vaccinate, well, okay, I don't admire the choice. The law does give some outlets for people who want to do that, state to state, as you said, but you are responsible. You bring your kid to the daycare center and infect my newborn and kill them, I think you're legally liable. If you take your child to Disneyland, as somebody did, knowing they've been exposed to the measles, you're liable. We haven't seen a lawsuit like that, but I think one is bound to come. And I think if you choose the exemption, you ought to be told right at that point, choose what you want, exempt if you choose, but you're responsible for any consequences of that choice that harm others.
And even if you're in a state, and even if you're one of these people who's exercised a philosophical exemption or a religious exemption, that's not, in your eyes, a get-out-of-jail-free card here. There should be consequences even for that population.
Absolutely. So when did we ever in America say, choose what you want, but the consequences don't matter? So yeah, we can allow you to choose many things, but we don't say, well, you know, if something bad happens, then that's not my problem. If you choose, as I said, to drive drunk, if you choose to beat your child, it doesn't mean you can choose whatever you want and you don't have to pay the piper if there are bad consequences as a result of that choice. This is not a society that simply admires choice and liberty and freedom. It also admires responsibility and taking accountability for what you do. We just haven't done that with vaccination choices.
All right, let's bring in our panel and see what they have to say. Dominic Carter, political journalist and author. Noam Bramson, Democratic mayor of New Rochelle and the 2013 Democratic nominee for the Westchester County Executive. Andrew Whitman as well, senior political correspondent. And Andrew, earlier today, had an interview as well. And to put in context, Andrew, you have a state lawmaker, Tom Abenanti, who's actually looking to make it more accessible for parents in the state of New York to have choice when it comes to this, theoretically putting more kids in the unvaccinated column.
He's a Democrat, so this is a bipartisan, interesting issue. He wants to increase the philosophical objection that people or parents might have. He's not necessarily convinced that some of the numbers that we're hearing are 100% accurate, that we've heard about the spread of measles or other things. He has an autistic son, who's I think 15 years old. That certainly plays a role in part of his thinking, but he's just not convinced that it's there, and he wants parents to be able to opt out of it if they're so inclined.
Okay, Mr. Mayor. Now, your job, among your job descriptions, is look out for the public safety and welfare of all your constituents. Listen to America, where people want to exercise their freedoms. They don't like being told what to do necessarily across the board. But how do you feel about making optionals too strong, but creating exemptions where people can decide what they feel like being vaccinated for and what they don't?
Well, look, you're right that individual choice and freedom is at the heart of who we are as Americans, but there's an old saying that my right to swing my fist ends at your nose. And the problem here is that when people opt out of vaccinations, it undermines the herd immunity that all of us are dependent upon. So it's not only their own families who are placed at risk, it's everybody who's placed at risk. And if there were any scientific evidence supporting the link between vaccination and autism or vaccination and other negative health effects, then we'd have a really serious ethical balance. But there is no such link. It is pure misinformation. And given that, I think we should be doing everything possible to encourage all parents to have their children vaccinated.
So if in New Rochelle, a family chooses not to vaccinate their child, and whether it be on religious objections or whatever objections that they claim to, do the doors of the school close to them? Can doctors be able to say, I don't want you in my waiting rooms? What happens to those people who make that choice as it relates to the public sphere?
Well, I think we're all trying to figure that out right now, and those are tough questions. But the first thing we should do, and the best thing we can do, is encourage people not to make that decision in the first place, to provide the kind of education and information that can overcome the myths and help people recognize that it is in their own interest and the interest of their community to get vaccines. I mean, this is settled science for decades, And all of the counter-arguments have been completely knocked down by subsequent studies. And there's, to some degree in this country, not among a majority, but among a few, sort of a strain of anti-science, a strain of disbelief in the scientific method.
Well, you just served the segue up for me, if I could. And again, for folks who say, oh, there's some crank in West Virginia who says, no, I'm going to give you 2 U.S. senators, one of which wants to be president, by the way. These are 2 statements from 2 Republican senators, Rand Paul from Kentucky and another senator as well. Let's bring them up for you to see here. This is Senator Paul, who said, I have heard of many tragic cases of walking, talking, normal children who wound up with profound mental disorders after vaccines, but I think parents should have some input. The state doesn't own your children. Think about that. He's completely disregarding what every national health organization has to say and basically saying, listen, be careful with your own kid. You vaccinate and they might turn into either a kid, it sounds like he's describing somebody that's a zombie, let alone a child that has autism. Another senator, this Republican Senator Tom Tillis out of North Carolina, he also opposes some of the health regulations, and specifically one that requires employees to wash their hands after using the restroom. And I think it speaks to the common vein here that we're hearing. He said, I don't have any problem. Can we bring that back up? I don't have any problem with Starbucks if they choose to opt out of this policy, as long as they post a sign that says, we don't require our employees to wash their hands after leaving the restroom. And Dominic, it speaks to that refrain of distrust of government, distrust of authority, telling people what to do with their own lives or whatever else. But my point is, it's one thing if you choose to believe that the president is from Kenya, or you choose to believe that Area 51's real and everything else. It's another thing if you choose to put my public health and safety at risk here because you don't subscribe to the idea that we live in a community and we have shared responsibility.
Yet, once again, Richard, we have entered the silly season when it comes to politics.
But with serious ramifications. This isn't just political posturing. You now have hundreds of cases of measles. You now have the situation here where it's 90% contractable for somebody that hasn't had the vaccine if they're in the presence of somebody. This is bad. This is something we fixed 15 years ago, and now we're having it all over again.
Well, Senator Rand Paul, considering that he's a medical doctor, I believe an ophthalmologist, he should be ashamed of himself in terms of he knows better. I agree with the mayor's assessment. Science is clear. I think we basically, I don't know, Andrew may, but clearly what's going on with Rand Paul, it's a play for libertarian support. It's a play for shoring up the base going into the presidential race. But Richard, this is ridiculous. It's ridiculous. I mean, so you should have a right to do whatever you want, and it can endanger the rest of our children. That's outright ridiculous.
And then here comes the rub, Andrew. Last night, as you know, on Wednesdays, we have the legal panel out here, and I asked him this question. I also asked the bioethicist from NYU the same thing. He's pretty clear. He says not only in cases where where parents choose to ignore state regulations and not inoculate the kid and create risk, but even when there are exemptions, they choose to exercise those exemptions, philosophical, religious, whatever the case may be, and put their kids in public venues and infect other children. There should be liability. Do you agree?
My only concern, I agree in theory, my only concern is the difficulty in proving it.
If you can prove it.
But that's a big if, and that could really clog things up. Yeah, I think there probably should be liability for those parents, but I think chasing that down might be so difficult that it might actually be prohibitive to doing it.
Just make a point. I reserve my criticism not so much for the parents, because if you honestly believe, perhaps misguided, but if you honestly believe that there's a health risk to your child posed by a vaccine, you're going to do anything you possibly can to protect your child. I reserve my criticism for the leaders like Rand Paul or others who are in a position of shaping opinions and providing information, who are giving credence to that kind of misunderstanding about what vaccines may do. That's the ultimate source of the problem.
But it's really,
and that's where we ought to correct it.
It's their political philosophy run amok, if you think about it, because Rand Paul is a libertarian and has been consistently. I mean, I think he deserves a little credit for that, being consistent with his policy, or his view, whether you agree with it or not. So the ultimate libertarian view is the government can't tell me to get this vaccine or not.
No, he went further. I'll let you finish it, but he went further. He didn't just say make your own choice. He says he's seen healthy children that all of a sudden have been either become autistic or become something of a shell of their old selves because they got the vaccine. That's different than saying libertarian to each their own.
Well, but
that's pandering.
And that seems to be coincidental as opposed to causational. I mentioned this the other day, where if I get a vaccine and then all of a sudden I get hit by a bus, somebody could make the argument, well, I mean, if you get a vaccine, it increases your risk of being hit by a bus. Look, I've seen an example. He got a vaccine and then he got hit. I think so. Yeah, I think he's susceptible to criticism on that front. The Tom Tillis quote is just, it's the regulation and government is bad philosophy run amok. That's right. I mean, he thinks that the open market can let restaurants decide, well, we don't need to have our people wash our hands as long as we post a sign, and the market will take care of it because nobody's going to go eat there anymore.
I'm going to be fascinated with what happens with Avenatti's proposed legislation as to if there's any support at all in New York for it. And we've seen Christie contort himself on the issue recently. I don't know. I just, it bothers me when we should debate. This is what America's about. We're about everybody having their own opinion about stuff. But then when you have fact, it seems some people celebrate the idea of conspiracy and celebrate the idea of throwing fact out and going with instinct as if that somehow matters. And it's fine if you want to do that with your own investments, but you don't do that where you imperil other kids' health. And that's the part that's just, okay, when we come back here, you got New York State Senator Malcolm Smith in a whole heap of trouble. He's been found guilty of corruption. We'll have the latest on not only his case, but also the news out of Albany and where Albany goes post the Shelley Silver controversy. We're going to talk about that and much more after this.